capstone, so all the spots are filled. So if you haven't yet contacted me, don't. It's not going to work. So we're not going to be able to accommodate everyone who's emailed me, but I already went through and double checked several of you. We were able to lift the blocks. So after class today, I go from here, I have to run over to one more class. But then I will be sending you emails if the block has been lifted for you. If you're curious, you can go in and try to enroll and see if you can. If you can, that means the block has been lifted. And I'll be contacting you about that. So, good thing. We do have 2 students. I'll also be emailing you where we need to talk a little bit more. It'll make sense in a bit. All right, any questions from Monday? Material, you guys are good? All right. Okay, let's go ahead and we'll just dive right into this. We'll see how far we get. Before we do, I just wanted to start off with a PRS question. So again, this week, these don't count for any points. We're just double checking and making sure that your devices, be it if you have a clicker or your phone, we're trying to make sure that those work. So here, if you have your phone, the ID for the class today is 998032. That's 998032. And you can go good. Everyone's clicking in. So that part at least is working. And I can mention, I already went and I downloaded the results from Monday, and I posted those in the grade book. I gave it one, I had given a point if you got an answer. The whole thing is worth 0, so it still doesn't count, but at least you can go in and see if your point registered properly. We've had a few people where it didn't. Either you aren't here, more likely I can tell if someone's trying to click in, and if you haven't registered with Turning Point, which also has the other name, point something, I forget, you need to make sure to do that. All right, so we have 61 people who responded, so that's a little better than the other day, so that's great, actually. So let's go through and let's see. Which of the following is not one of the 3 main things to remember about MedBot? Remember I was telling you the other day, there's 3 main things. You will know this by the end of the class. So let's see what people said, and it's going to do this lovely little countdown. So we had method of administration, plants are complex, dosage, 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 and if anyone says that that's not one of them, dosage, dosage, dosage. Ooh. So plant chemicals are only found in the roots. I made that up. So 98% of you are correct that plant chemicals are only found in the roots is something I made up. In fact, they're found throughout the plant. It does turn out that some plant species, chemicals might be most potent in the roots, and others it might be in the stem or the leaves, sometimes in the flowers or buds. If you guys have cloves, for example, you see the clove itself, it's actually a bud that's been dried up. All right. So I always like to start with cool facts about plants. One of my little ideas here is that at the end of the class, end of the semester, I want you all to think, well, plants are pretty cool. So this is an example of a plant which is actually mimicking its environment. Oftentimes we think about animals as doing this. A lot of the animals can actually camouflage themselves and match their surroundings. This is a plant. It's known as sweet pine sap. And this is one of my grad students years ago did a whole project where the plant itself, these are essentially leaves that have senesced on the plant but are still retained. So it just looks like the leaf litter around it. It's called sweet pine sap because it has a really potent sweet smell in the air. And again, we talked about what that means is volatile chemicals coming out, right? So it's pumping out these chemicals. And so my student did an experiment where this is the plant itself, and then he took off, these are technically called bracts, and he took those off, and you can see it's this purplish color. And what happened was that herbivores nailed it. So it's actually hiding. Now, one of the things you might think for a plant, if you can't see it, how's it going to be pollinated? And that's where that odor comes in, because the bees and such, this is pollinated a lot by halicted bees and solitary bees. They're cueing in not by sight, but by smell. So just an interesting example of how plants can undergo cryptic mimicry. All right. So let's talk about history. Now, it's really important as we think about medical botany, we always start thinking about the history of medical botany because it's been around for, I don't want to say ever, but for an extremely long time. If we can think about, okay, when were plants first used with a medicinal reason, the closest, what people suggest is back in prehistoric times, so 60,000 years ago in Iraq, there's a number of different caves there. And one of them, this is a recreation, so don't get too excited. There were bones that were found, essentially fossilized remains of a Neanderthal man who was buried there. And there's his skull pieced together. But the interesting thing was there were remains of plants scattered around the body and placed in such a way, and of course this is us interpreting maybe what happened, and we could very easily be wrong. But the scientists have suggested is that the plants were placed there for a purpose. It might have been something where maybe if that person, if they were going to perceive afterlife, they would need to have those plants with them. Maybe it was something that was valuable, would have been used medicinally at that time period. The cool thing is when you look at what plants were there, and we can identify those, which I think is pretty neat, ephedra shows up. Ephedra, we'll be talking about this one a lot. There's species all over the world, but in the Middle East, ephedra, and actually here too, is oftentimes used as a cardiac stimulant. So heartbeat, to get that going, and also for respiratory problems. Even today, you can go into a Whole Foods store or something like that, a herbal store, well, even just, mainstream stores too now, and you can see pills and things for ephedra. Another one is yarrow. And this plant, we have yarrow species here too in the US. This is used as an astringent. So again, if someone had to ask, okay, when were plants used? The earliest perceived time is 60,000 years ago. And then you could do things. There's another cave in Spain, and again, another Neanderthal. But here, this is someone who was 50,000 years old. And this is really cool. You could actually get the remains, and here's the teeth. And they could look at the tartar of the teeth. And because we have genetic analysis now, you can identify what plants were actually in the tartar, because the tartar essentially is, fossilizes. So the teeth then showed evidence of, again, yarrow pops up again, but then also chamomile. So chamomile, if you guys, chamomile tea, that's the chamomile plant. It's an aster in the sunflower family, and chamomile tea is known to be anti-inflammatory. Oftentimes people use it as a sleep aid. And if you've never done chamomile tea yourself from scratch, it's actually the flower heads that you dry and then you steep in water. So that's what that is. And then going forward now, 5,300 years ago, we have this guy. He's the Tyrolean Iceman, known as Otzi. And this was a body that was uncovered in the Italian Alps. As the air was warming, the glaciers were retreating. At the time his body was discovered, and here you can see a picture of it in situ, people thought it was someone who had been dead probably, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 years. And then they didn't realize until they started testing and looking a little bit more carefully that this was someone who died 5,300 years ago. If you do carbon dating, you figure that out. This is a recreation of what that person likely looked like. He was a hunter. He also had a bag, and he had things with him. He was actually, if I remember correctly, he was killed through a spear in the back. So someone murdered him. But what happened was, in this bag that he had, which was very well preserved because it was a glacier area, it was frozen essentially, there was a bunch of moss. And so this is the species of moss. And in the bag, you can see it looks like just dried things. But if you get that moss and you reactivate it, you get some water, it starts growing again, it becomes very green and lush. And so scientists started to talk about, well, why did he have moss with him? Maybe it had a medicinal impact. Someone said, no, maybe it's like a first aid kit. So if he started bleeding or something, it was like a Band-Aid. You can use it to absorb any blood or moisture. A lot of cultures around the world, indigenous peoples, oftentimes when they have little babies, they'll diaper them with moss. It's very absorbent. And so those were some ideas. But again, there's a use of plants argue whether it was specifically medicinal or not. But essentially what I'm trying to get you guys the point is that many ancient records that we have in multiple areas around the world indicate that indigenous, that native peoples in those areas used plants for medicinal uses, and that they developed these uses independently of one another. We start to see sometimes the same plant species used in similar ways in two different areas that would never in the past contact each other. So really, really exciting. So here's an example in ancient China. I had told you the other day about how the Chinese, remember we talked about the Chinese medicine, and we talked about Ayurvedic, which we're going to get to here in a moment. But the Chinese were well ahead of anyone else in terms of medicinal precision. And so back in 2700 BC, there was one of the emperors, Emperor Shennong, and he wrote what's known as the Pinsao. This is what was known as the Great Herbal. So an herbal is usually, and we'll get to a few of these in the book, or in a bit, it's usually a book. But here it was an oral tradition that was handed down, and eventually it was written down. And what Shennong did, and you can see it was eventually published around 1600. What he did was he had all these different herbal cures, and the story goes that he tested them on himself first to make sure they were okay. And if you remember the other day, we were talking about how a lot of plant compounds, they're the chemicals. And so a little bit can help you, a lot can hurt you, more than that will kill you. So the fact that he actually tested, I don't know if he really tested them on himself. But anyways, that's the story. That it actually went back to him who lived even further, a longer time ago. Now, one of the questions I always get from you guys is, okay, do I need to know all this on a test? So I'm not going to ask you questions like, what was the date that this came about? But I've given you the dates because I want you to be thinking about, hey, this was really long ago. And in a test, in a question, I might say something like, I'm trying to get you to answer the Roman emperor's name. And I might say, back in 2700 BC, there was this thing that was written, and hopefully I'll give you some clues and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's what that was. So that's why I'm giving you a lot of these details to help you retain this later on. Okay, so here's some examples of what this Pinsao said. It described 365 medicinal species, plants. Opium, ephedra, hemp, ricin, and chamugra are just a few of these. So opium, we'll be talking about, if you don't already know, opium's been used to make morphine. And ephedra, we just talked about that, remember? So that one pops up. Today, that's where we get ephedrine, which is used for asthma. If any of you guys have asthma, you might have an inhaler, and you can look at the ingredients there. Hemp, of course, is cannabis. We're going to be talking about cannabis later on in the semester. People get confused because there's marijuana and there's hemp, and some people say it comes from the same species or 3 different species. We'll be talking all about that. Hemp is really critical. It does not, it's used for rope. It's used to make clothing. It does not have the psychologically active ingredient THC. So you can't, get a high off of it. But hemp has been used throughout history, throughout time, just as a fiber. And then ricin is where we can get castor oil. Rice is also extremely potent poison, one of the most poisonous substances on the planet. And so we'll be talking about that later. Now, chamugra, if you're like, what the heck is that? This is actually an oil that was discovered in the 1800s. At the time period, there was leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, in which, it's a horrible disease. Literally parts of your digits and your nose and things like that get infected and fall off. It's contagious. So people at that time period, if you were diagnosed with Hansen's disease of leprosy, you were sent off to a colony to die. So in fact, in the Hawaiian Islands where I work, one of the islands was actually a leper colony. And so people, you'd be forced to leave your whole family if you go live there. People lived there a number of years. But at the time period, people died. So in the 1800s, Western doctors said, hey, we discovered this. Guess what? No, the Chinese did it long time earlier. People just didn't talk. So that's the Chinese. Now let's go over to Egypt. The ancient Egyptians were also had this whole medical knowledge, this medical field that they studied, and it did include plants. So the Ebers Papyrus is something really is well known among the medical field. This document dates from about 1500 BC, so this has been around a long time. You can unroll the whole thing. It's 70 feet in length, really long. But the cool thing about this is it lists 850 plant remedies and their medicines. It also tells you how to prepare things, which is important. It's not just a list of plants. It's like you take leaves from here, steep it here, do this, apply it this way. This document was obtained by George Ebers in the early 1870s, so hence his name gets tacked onto it. Honestly, though, there's evidence that he probably got it from some people in the Middle Eastern area, and he likely stole it. So this is one of these colonial time periods where quite horrible things happen, but essentially he has his name on the Ebers Papyrus. Now this document, what it does is it mentions mandrake, we'll talk about in just a moment, aloe, oftentimes used for skincare, castor bean, opium, garlic. Garlic, it turns out, and I think it might be here next, oh, maybe not. The ancient Egyptians, when they were building the pyramids, they would have the slaves building those pyramids, and they were giving them tons of garlic. And the reason was the garlic is a really good anti-worming agent and anti-parasitic thing. So you're trying to keep your slaves keep working, so you don't want them to get parasites and get sick. So in the Ebers Papyrus, there's essentially what we would call chapters. There's sections that go over all these different things: intestinal disease, ophthalmology, the eyes. I mean, go through everything. Contraception. They're talking about how to prevent a pregnancy, how to enhance a pregnancy. I mean, all these different things: dentistry, fractures, burns, tumors, everything. So really, really cool. Now, I told you about a lot of the work earlier. Also, our medical knowledge comes from India. This is a whole other culture. Again, the Egyptians obviously are not talking. Probably aren't talking to the Chinese, who really aren't talking probably to the Indians. But in India, in ancient India, there's a sacred document known as the Rig Veda. And this details the medical information. So this came about 1500 BC. It's a Sanskrit writings. And this document is the basis for the Ayurvedic system of medicine. In every class, every year, I usually have someone in the class who knows about Ayurvedic medicine, comes from that culture, has family where, that's what you do. If you remember the pictures that I showed earlier the other day, we had the Chinese where you go to the market, your pharmacy, and you have the plants. Same thing with Ayurvedic medicine. There's this recognition of the importance of plants and a reliance upon them. So in many Hindu communities today, including here in the United States, this Ayurvedic system of medicine is still practiced. So if any of you are going to become a medical doctor and you're going to be prescribing things, this is another good reason why you need to be asking your patient, like, what other things are you doing? We talked about drug interactions and things like that. So that's another thing to remember. Example here of this plant, if you're wondering, is snake root. And this is used to treat snake bite and also mental illness, interestingly. And we'll talk later about why. It's actually a calming agent. It's going to activate what's known as your parasympathetic nervous system. We'll talk about in a bit. The other thing I want to mention, oftentimes when I give you these names of these plants, you'll see two things. You're going to see the common name, snake root. You're going to see the Latin binomial name, Raufolia serpentina. And I always get the question, do I need to know both? No. On a test, I'm going to give you both. Some people honestly go best with the common name. Some people love the Latin name. Whatever works for you. Honestly, for me, I flip back and forth. Dr. Kepi, whenever we're teaching together, he, of course, knows the Latin name. I'm more on the common name, and so it works together. But you'll be given both those names, the common name and the scientific, the Latin name. And from this plant, we actually get a compound known as reserpine or reserpine. I've heard it pronounced two different ways. And this is one, again, it's more of a calming agent. We'll be talking a lot about this compound later on. So that's where it comes from. All right, let's talk about the New World. So we've talked about China, Egypt, India. What's going on here in the New World, North and South America, Central America? Well, it turns out that there is what's known as the Aztec herbal. This was a document that was essentially written by an Aztec physician who was given the Spanish name Martin de la Cruz. Obviously, that's not his Aztec name. And this was written about 1552. If you can think of your history, this was a time period when the Spanish conquistadors and everyone was coming over. Spain was laying claim to all these big, great lands. And so they were, in their view, educating, the indigenous people. But Martin de la Cruz, this Aztec physician, obviously learned, was educated, and he was able to write things down. So this herbal then was sent back across the ocean to the Vatican as a present, probably, for the Pope. Here's this wonderful document for you, and then they just shelved it in the Vatican. So in 1929, it was rediscovered. Someone was going to the library and figured this out and recognized its importance. And then in 1939, they tried to translate it. And I'm saying try to translate it because here is an image from it. And this is interesting. So here, this word here talks about glaucoma, an eye problem. We'll be talking about the glaucoma later. And in here in Latin, there's sort of a description of it. But the problem is, here's the Aztec name for it, and here's an image of the plant. We don't know what the heck this is. Because there's very few, if any, people left who can actually speak that dialect of Aztec, of that language. There's many dialects within the Aztec language, within the Mayan language, and so forth. So we do not know what this plant is. We are sorely in need of some way to treat glaucoma. It's very, very common. I'm developing it too, it's all my family. But, here's this potential source, but we don't know what it is. So some of these we know, others are a mystery. So they do talk about, in this book, Martin de la Cruz talks about 180 New World species. So pretty cool. Now what we're going to do is we're going to flip over to Greece. We're going to talk about Greece for quite a little bit. The Greeks get a lot of credit. So we have like Hippocrates, right? You guys are going to go into the medical field. People argue that the herbal medicine of ancient Greece really laid the foundations of Western medicine. Yeah, probably, but remember we already talked about there's all these other places around the world, these other cultures who are way ahead of the Greeks way earlier. So the Greeks are sort of getting all the credit, but there's a lot of other things that were happening. So good old Hippocrates, let's start with him there. I'm giving you the dates here again. You don't need to know those dates, but it's just to give you a context of the big scheme of things, what was going on. So 460 to 377 BC was when Hippocrates lived. So, of course, he was a scholar and physician, known as the father of medicine. For those of you who want to become a doctor, there's a Hippocratic oath, which it turns out if you research that, there's no central Hippocratic oath. It's really weird. People sort of morph it into their own. And if you read the whole thing, it's actually quite fascinating. I taught a class on dying well last time, and so we were looking a little bit at the Hippocratic oath, and I was researching that, and it's actually quite interesting. We were talking about euthanasia and what it actually says in terms of euthanasia and abortion and controversial topics like that. Anyways, getting off the topic, but what Hippocrates did was he was important because he came at a time period where doctors, if you were sick, you would go to someone who's the doctor, and I'm using air quotes, because what they did was that they diagnosed things based on magic, based on, cures even. They would say, oh, I had a dream, and this is what you should do. And so, some people, random chance might be better, some might not. So Hippocrates was the first one who came along and said, okay, no. We need to have a better system of doing this. We're not going to do this magic stuff. We are going to focus on what we know. We're going to write things down, keep track of things. He also was one of the first who really strongly promoted plants as a way to treat different ailments. And what he believed is that when someone was sick, they had an ill humor, is what he called it. People of the day probably, with the magic idea, probably thought you have an evil spirit in your body. You got to get rid of that evil spirit. And so what he would do, though, he'd say, no, it's not an evil spirit. It's just an ill humor. We have these different humors, he would call them, good and bad, in our bodies. And in order to get rid of the bad one, you have to physically get it out of your body. So he would have purgatives and emetics. So essentially, he would give plants to patients that would either force them to vomit or the other end. So a purgative. So emetic is vomiting. Purgative is actually inducing a bowel movement, and sometimes quite violently. So we are going to be talking about both of those things later on. Plants are really good for that. And so that's what he would do. So a few years later, 371 to 287 BC, was Theophrastus. Theophrastus was another Greek, and he's sort of cool. He was actually a student of Plato and Aristotle. He is known today as the father of botany. So Hippocrates, of course, used plants, but Theophrastus he really studied plants, was able to ID them. He wrote this book, Historia Plantarum, the history of plants. And there's a whole bunch of editions, but I'm just showing you this one's from 1567. These books, if you're into this, they're beautifully illustrated. These are ones that are going to be handwritten by monks in monasteries and really polished. So he had 500 different plants. Sort of like the Rig Veda, actually. He didn't just have a list of plants, but he talked about how to prepare them, but he also talked about how to collect them. Because do you collect, like we talked about earlier, the roots, the leaves, the flowers, the buds? What is the part? Usually it's one part has more of the chemicals in it than others. How do you do that? So that was really important. A few hundred years later, 200, 300 years later, Dioscorides comes along, another Greek. Okay, Dioscorides is, I'm going to put this all up here. He was interesting. He was a Greek, but he was a surgeon in Nero's army. Your Roman, I did Latin for a number of years, so you guys unfortunately get a whole Roman Latin part to this. But Nero was the emperor who was really bad, did crazy stuff. But the point is that Dioscorides, he got to travel around the world, the Roman Empire. He was a surgeon, he could go wherever the armies went. And so he got to actually talk to all these different people in other parts of the world. And so he took that knowledge, he put it together, and he wrote his book known as De Materia Medica. And this was so important. This book, it was translated to Arabic and Persian. It was used for centuries. And so here, now he has another list of, 600 plants this time. He's talking about the properties they use, how to grow them, so a little bit more information, which is helpful. But then, this is the cool part. This is what I want you guys to remember. The thing that he did was he goes into a lot of detail about the plants, how to prepare them. He's talking about side effects. Like, hey, this is good for this, but watch out for X, Y, and Z. It's going to make you nauseous, but you're going to get better in the end. So some of these are still in use. Willow bark tea, which was, of course, the precursor to aspirin. And then I have to tell you, the Native Americans here, the indigenous people here in North America, also were using willow bark tea too. So here we have these independent developments where different peoples who would never contact each other had figured out on their own that this plant was helpful. So this document alone, this De Materia Medica, this book, formed the basis of medicine in Europe for the next 1,000 years. So can you imagine that? Like one of you guys, you're like, oh, I'm gonna write this book, and it's gonna be used for the next 1,000 years. That's amazing. So that's what he's known for doing. The other thing I really want you guys to remember and this will be on the test. I love this, so I'll put it on the test. So I'm warning you. Is that he also recognized what I call botanical nuances. What this is it's things about plants that if you don't know, you just miss it. So for example, he knew that when you collect that plant, whatever you're collecting, if it's a leaf or a seed or something, the time of day that you collect that can actually be really important. It can influence what we call the medicinal potency. So an example here, shown here, this is opium poppy. We'll be talking about that more. Beautiful plant. So this one, if you collect the capsule, normally what you do is you're going to cut this a little bit and the latex comes out and that becomes the opium. It dries. We'll talk about this in a bit. But if you collect that capsule in the morning, it's going to have 4 times more morphine in it than if you collect that same capsule you wait a few hours and you cut it at night. So what's going on here is the plants usually wake up around, you have sunrise, about an hour or two later they wake up. And you can actually measure this. You can measure their photosynthetic rate, and you can see them start to ramp up their photosynthetic machinery. So what the plants are doing is in the early morning, they're ramping up their defensive compounds because they're like, hey, if someone's gonna come and eat me, some stupid cow, I'm gonna have my little chemical arsenal, right? And then later on in the evening, they're like, I don't need it anymore, and so then they ramp it back down. So Dioscorides picked up on that. All right, so that's the Greeks. Now I mentioned that some of the Greek information then was transmitted over to Persia in the Arabian area. And so a lot of people also don't realize in Persia, there was also this huge collection of knowledge, medical knowledge. So Avicenna here was a court physician at the age of 18. Isn't that amazing? But back then, people didn't live very long. So if you were like probably 40 or even 30, you were probably really, really old. We'll talk about that later too. But he wrote what's known as the Canon of Medicine, which was used for the next 500 years. This book was so important that it was then translated back into the Greek and the Roman texts. Greek and Latin, essentially, is how it was translated. The other thing that is really important to think about is the Arabs essentially established the first drugstores. So we have Walmart, CVS on every corner. You think we're first? No. So back in the 8th century, Baghdad itself, the city, was known as pretty much the place to go across the whole world. If you wanted to have any medical knowledge, they had a wonderful library, you'd be going to Baghdad. And so that was something that a lot of people don't really think about nowadays. So here's some examples of some of these illustrations that they would have. And so you can see, there's text there, but then there's these pictures that are extremely helpful now to us as botanists. We can sort of figure it out. This bottom one, we're going to be talking about in just a little bit. This is I can't read any of the text, of course, but I can tell you this picture is the mandrake. And it's very typical. You'll see this in a little bit. So these textbooks, you can see the picture of the plant, description, information about it, very, very important. So that was going on for a long time. And then we hit the Renaissance period. And so this is where the printed book, the printing press eventually gets developed. People could print out books. These herbals become extremely important. And the Renaissance was a time period where people were, usually men, wanted to learn. There was a burst of learning in all new fields. Science, there was advances. Philosophy, there was advances. Art, there was all sorts of wonderful things happening. So at the time, this was also the revival of what we call herbalism for medicinal plants. And so by herbalism, I'm talking about, here they would talk about the traditional or folk medicine. I like the term cultural use of plants. But they're trying to talk about how these plants were used. So you can see here, the illustrations and then the text all around it. So again, the printing press was invented in 1440, and so that sort of ushered in all this time period where now you can make a lot of these books instead of having the monks, do it by hand, it costs a lot of money. Now the price comes down because now you can make more of them, and more generally, more people can buy them. So the books containing information to identify the plants, their medical uses, but notice magical powers that still starts to creep in there. And then sometimes still in these books, there's superstition and misinformation. So here's an example of one of the texts. There's a dragon. So they're talking about the use of this dragon for something. So every once in a while you see there's still some level of, I don't know, magic and things floating around. And eventually, every once in a while it makes it to some of these books. So they're sort of fun. In 1597, there was known as one of the best known modern herbals, is just simply known as the herbal, or the general history of plants. So John Gerald, he published this thing. I guess you could call it published it. This is the best known English herbal. It does include the first description of potato. Potato is a New World species. So this is the first time the potato actually shows up in one of these herbals. And I thought there was a potato on the cover. No, not on this one. One of them actually has the potato down here. So it's sort of cool. The thing, though, with this guy, John Gerald, he had no scientific experience at all. The rumor is that he bought/stole the book off someone in Denmark, I think, and then published it as his own. So this might be a big case of plagiarism. But he gets all the credit. It also made him extremely wealthy. All right. So in the medieval period here, there's a concept that I want you guys to really get. And it's important because you still see it today, actually, popping up. And it's what's known as the doctrine of signatures. So the doctrine of signatures is essentially an idea that the plant is trying to tell us something, or God, through the plant, is trying to tell us something. So the medicinal use of the plant can be detected through what they call signatures. Today we'd say traits or characteristics. These could be something from the shape of the plant, its smell, the taste, the texture, how it grows. But the plant is trying to tell us something. So an example is a walnut. So if you look at a walnut, you might say, you crack it open. So this is, you have the inner part. You're like, oh my gosh, it's just like a brain. Oh, that is good for brain. You need to eat walnuts for your memory. So walnuts, therefore, are good for our memory. I have no idea if that happens. I don't think so. I like walnuts, but I couldn't walnut. So some people at the time period said things like the Almighty God or whoever must have put clues into plants as a means of curing the diseases which he also created. So these diseases came into being, but we as humans are given the means to treat these diseases, but we have to listen and look and be observant and figure out what the plants are trying to tell us. So, example here, this is hepatica. Does anyone know what this one is? A common name? So it has to do with your liver. So people will look at this and be like, oh, these lobes look like a liver. Therefore, it has to be helpful for the liver. Turns out no, but whatever. Sometimes it does work. It actually, it does happen. So here's a few ones. So these are people where they had some of these herbals, they had pictures of grasses, and then they looked at the roots, they're fibrous, and they thought, oh, that looks like a hand. And they actually pictured it with hands. Here's another whole set of plants where if you look at the infructescence, which is the collection of fruits, on some species, this is known as a chyme, it looks sort of like the tail of a scorpion. So they're like, oh, that is useful if you get stung by a scorpion. Somehow you have to use the plant some way. You had to figure that one out. But the plant, that was its use. That's why it was put on Earth to help the scorpions. Okay, so I mentioned the mandrake. If you remember the mandrake in that one image we had earlier. And this is a really great example I wanted to show you of the doctrine of signatures. And it sort of went crazy. And you have probably seen this in your own lifetime, but you might not have realized. So, Mandragoria officinarum is the scientific name of the plant. And this is what it looks like. If you found it growing, somewhere, it's not below, so this is going to be more in Eurasia. But if you found this plant growing, it's just going to be this little tiny thing, some flowers. Now, if you dig it up, you get this, it has sort of like a rooting structure, almost like carrots that are sort of divided. It's really tough and fibrous. And people would look at that and say, oh, it's a human. Oftentimes, if it's the right branching and little arms and legs. And so they actually have these images where you'd always see the plant itself, and then this looks like a body here with two legs coming out. And then furthermore, there's this whole idea that if you looked at the fruits, they say, oh, you know what? If you look at the fruits, the little balls, those are the males, the male ones, right? And if you look at the fruits, if they're sort of pear-shaped, then that would be a female. Sort of interesting, because if you think about females, the uterus, it's like an upside-down pear. So the idea here is that the roots resemble human forms. Therefore, these were useful for fertility, for reproduction of the form. So that's what people thought for a long, long time. They also associated this with Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Again, getting back to love, fertility, romance, aphrodisiac. All right. Okay, so this plant was so important that people were worried that the commoners would come and start digging up all the plants, as it was valuable, because people would pay lots of money for like an aphrodisiac. Still happens today. So there's all these protective legends, and so one was that, and you see this showing up in a lot of these images that you might see in older books. You're like, what the heck is going on? So the idea is that the mandrake, here you can see the mandrake is like a sleeping little person here. The idea is that the mandrake, if you disturb it, it will shriek, and it will either kill you or drive you mad. That was the legend, that was the urban myth. People believe this. So what they would say is that you have to find the plant, trace a circle 3 times around the plant with your sword, and then you have to cut it while facing west. I have no idea why. But the thing was, you had to put wax in your ears, because the thing, when it comes up, it's going to shriek and you don't want to die. And so then what they would do is they would take a dog and they would tie it. So he has a leash here, and this, you can't really see it here, but it's tied around the neck of the mandrake. And the idea is that you would tie the dog up and you walk away and you'd be like, come on, dog. And the dog would be like, go running over. And in the process, rip out the mandrake. So you're not doing it, but that's what these are all about. So then you can see things in different texts. Here's the mandrake here, dog running off. In this case, it's tied to the legs. But that's the whole idea of the mandrake. So here's another one. Again, the guy here, the collector, is holding his ears, right? Here's the dog, down to the arm here. This looks like probably a female. Well, I don't know. That's a male. I don't know. Anyways, so you see all these different things, but the same idea. This idea even invades a lot of more common areas that people might not realize. So in the Christian Bible, in Genesis 30, 14, 16, there's a whole section about Rachel and Leah. They were sisters who were married to the same man. He really liked Rachel, but Leah was the older. He was tricked into marrying Leah. And so he had a bunch of kids with Leah. He didn't have any with Rachel. And so she wanted to have children. And so Leah's son had found some mandrakes. And so Rachel goes over to him and says, to her sister, and says, can I just have some of those mandrakes? Because I want to get pregnant. And in response, the sister says, well, I want something. She says, okay, you can sleep with our husband tonight, which she does. And Leah ends up getting pregnant, which is sort of funny. But there's this whole part here where in Genesis, it talks about the mandrakes and these two sisters. And that's what's going on. Because the mandrakes are a sign of fertility, and people would literally, they were valuable. They would bargain for these things, especially women if they wanted to get pregnant. So that's what happens. Even in Romeo and Juliet, there's a whole part there Alack, it is not like that eye, so early waking with what loathsome smells and shrieks like mandrakes torn out of the earth, that living mortals hearing them run mad. So again, that's what they're talking about. And here's what it's saying if you went to Harry Potter. What, the second one maybe? So there's a whole scene of where they're trying to plant mandrakes and they're pulling them up. That's what it's all about. So there, now you guys know. That is the shrieking mandrake. And that's why they all have little earmuffs. And then what, Neville comes over. Anyways, that's what it's all about. So even in modern film, there's like botanical jokes and stuff. So the botanists, of course, are all laughing their heads off over this. And other people are like, oh, it's so cute. But that's what's going on. All right? Okay. So there's other uses of mandrake through time. It's not just as, fertility. It turns out that mandrake was used by good old friend Dioscorides. Remember, we talked about him. And he used it as a surgical anesthetic. So remember, there's a lot of surgeries at the time period if they didn't have any anesthetic. It's like, okay, we got to take off your arm, hold you down. Here's the saw. Today, we're very, fortunate that we have all sorts of anesthetics. But back when they didn't. But they did have mandrake, so they would take the extract of the mandrake, mix it with wine, and give it to the patient. So essentially, it would knock them out a little bit where they could have the surgery. It also was used as a poison. Remember, dosage. So a little bit of this mandrake can be helpful, but a lot of it can kill. So the Borgia family was well known as killing their family, and so they used fermented mandrake. Agrippina, who was the wife of the Emperor Claudius, she at one point was worried that the nephew was going to try to take over the Roman Empire, so she killed him using the mandrake. So, and this is the ring the Borgia family would have. So you'd be wearing a ring and you'd have the solution in the ring. And the idea is that you'd be at a little dinner and you'd like lean over, just open it up and put the solution into their cup, and go back, and then they drink it. And it's pretty fast acting. So today, we know that the active component of mandrake, there's many different things. Remember we talked about complexity? There's a lot of different compounds in this plant. But the one here that we're talking about is known as hyoscine. It also is known as scopolamine. I'm going to give you both names. I'm putting these up here because oftentimes I have people who work in pharmacies. And so they're like, oh, I don't know that name, but I know that name. So that's what it is. This is the chemical structure. I'm going to be giving you some of the chemical structures. There may be on the test later on a few things where you have to recognize them. This will be more clear in a few days. We're going to talk about how to do that. But the point is, we know what this thing is. We can actually recreate it in the lab too now. You actually might know this compound too, in a way. This is what is used for motion sickness patches. So if you ever have motion sickness, if you're on a boat or car or whatever, there's these little patches that you put behind your ear or on your wrists and things like that. That's scopolamine. And so that is a central nervous system depressant. Sort of calms you down in a way. It's also used now as a sedative for surgery and also to dry things out. So what we're going to do is we are going to have one more question. And here's another clicker question for you. We just talked about this. So hopefully you guys should all do really, really well. And so what I want to know is, what is the name of the idea that plant traits, what I'm calling them, indicate their medicinal use? We've got some choices here. I should also tell you, I like to be funny.
I think so.
So usually I'll put a really ridiculous answer on there, just to see if anyone goes for it. This also happens on tests. I feel like if you're taking a test, it's like really long and boring, so I have to give you something to laugh at. All right, so we have 66, 65, 66, there we go, 66. That's pretty much what we had last time. So let's see what you guys have. We're going to have a 10-second countdown, and then we'll probably end after this. We'll pick up on Friday. We'll be able to. But the answer is actually the doctor's signature. Scary. Everyone got it. Woo! That was an easy one. Okay. So we're going to stop here. On Friday, we'll pick up on the 18th century and be able to catch up on everything by the end of Friday. All right. So if anyone has questions about anything, feel free to come up. Again, for those of you in the capstone, I'll be sending out a message in about 2 hours letting you know that you can